actually two different Haftorahs for this parsha. One is Ashkenaz and one is Sfarad. Usually Chabad will follow the Sfarad Haftorah, but not in this case. In this case, you follow the Ashkenaz Haftorah. So Bistik will say a word about the Sfarad Haftarah, which we're not going to discuss. It's not, we read it in the 3 weeks before Rosh Hashanah, before the 9th of Av. But the Sfarad Haftarah is the beginning of the book of Jeremiah. And the beginning of the book of Jeremiah is a discussion how Jeremiah says that God speaks to him. And Jeremiah says, Yirmiyahu says, I can't speak. I'm not right for the job. Lo yadati daber, I don't know how to speak. I'm a nar, I'm a young lad. And of course, God says, don't worry, I'm with you, and I'm going to give you the strength to be the prophet and carry the word of God, despite the fact that nobody was listening. So that is a clear connection to our parsha, because our parsha, of course, an important theme of the parsha is the selection of Moshe as the prophet to the people, as the messenger to the people. Now, Moshe also did not want to go. Moshe also felt that he can't speak. It says, Kvad peh, kvad lashon anochi, I have a heavy mouth and a heavy tongue. He couldn't speak. So just like Moshe, Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, also does not want to go doesn't want to take the job of being the speaker, God's spokesman to the people of Judea. So in any case, we don't say that Haftorah. We use that Haftorah in the first of the 3 weeks before the 9th of Av, which is the 3 weeks of Puranut, of a rebuke, 3 Haftorahs of rebuke. The Sfardim use it both that case and in this case, and in this parsha. The Haftorah that we take is from Isaiah begins at chapter 27, and then we read part of chapter 28 and part of chapter 29. And there, it's not so much that it's not about the theme of the selection of the prophet, but it's more general. It makes mention about the Jewish people coming into Egypt and how they flourished in Egypt. So it's almost like that's the beginning of the parsha. Our parsha is divided into 2 parts. In the beginning is we talk about the slavery and the oppression, and then later, the second half of the parsha is where Moshe is selected. So I would say the Haftorah, the Sfarad custom focuses on the second half. The Haftorah of the Ashkenaz custom focuses on the first half. So that's with that introduction, maybe it's time to look at the details. Let's say one more introduction of the big picture. One more introduction is as follows. If you look at the time that the Jewish people are in Egypt, they really don't have any hope for the redemption, in the sense that it's not like the situation becoming better gradually. The contrary, in this week's parsha, it keeps getting worse. Even after Moshe was chosen and selected and convinced to go to Pharaoh, and Moshe goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. What happens? It's not that Pharaoh lessens the burden. To the contrary, Pharaoh increases the burden on the people. So it's not a story of gradual redemption. It gets darker, it gets worse before it gets better. In other words, there's no gradual transition into the redemption, which means that if you're a Jewish person living in Egypt who has already selected, you're in a state, you would be forgiven to being in a state of despair, right? And that's really what happens. When Moshe comes, people are very happy, but after Pharaoh does not listen, people are upset at Moshe and they back into the situation of despair. And in the exile, it's the same story. What Isaiah is referring to is the future exile. Also, it's a great state of despair. It's not like gradual getting better. And Isaiah says a very beautiful verse that we're going to read. And it says, on that day, in the end of days, in other words, when the redemption comes about, Yitakav a shofar gadol, a great shofar will be sounded. In other words, what is the imagery of a shofar? The imagery of the shofar is that not the people necessarily working and bettering their circumstance, right? That you don't need a shofar. You don't need a great shofar from heaven. The great shofar from heaven represents not just the shofar, but a great shofar. I think this is the only time in scripture where it says the word great shofar. Shofar is the sound that comes. In some sense, that's God's miraculous intervention without the gradual growth toward redemption that the human being brings to the table. So in that sense, the prophet is talking about the people who are in despair and pointing out to them and showing to them that the fact that you don't see any gradual growth or gradual light or gradual steps toward redemption doesn't mean that redemption cannot come immediate, because the great shofar could sound at any point. That's just by introducing this point. Now, what is the big theme of what is the flow of the Haftorah of this story, especially when we get to chapter 28? So, who is Isaiah? Isaiah is a prophet that primarily is in the kingdom of Judah. He's in the kingdom of Judea, in the southern kingdom, and Isaiah turns to the 10 tribes. The 10 tribes who seceded from Judea years earlier, generations earlier, and he refers to them as Ephraim. We discussed this last week when we discussed that the most populous tribe of the 10 tribes and the most prominent tribe of the 10 tribes was Ephraim. And he goes after Ephraim because Ephraim, if you know the history, become corrupt, and they become totally involved in their own pleasures, and they're not able to see that the trouble is right beyond the horizon. In other words, at this point in the time of Isaiah, they're still very successful in the sense that they're very wealthy. However, the end of their kingdom was coming very quickly because they were going to be overrun and exiled by the kingdom of Assyria. They are too involved in their own pleasures to recognize that. So in the beginning of chapter 28, you read how Isaiah, in beautiful description, rebukes them for being drunken in wine. In other words, they're totally drunk, intoxicated. They can't see clearly. They can't understand what is coming because they are too invested in their own sensual pleasures. After that, Isaiah sort of turns to his own kingdom, which is Judea, Yehuda. He gives a few verses of praise, talking to them about how they are not like Ephraim. They are not like the 10 tribes. They are still committed to justice and to Torah and to God. However, he says, they too are not completely the way they should be. And then after a few verses of praising Judah, he then goes to rebuke Judah, and then goes to say that Judah has their own problems, not as bad, not as severe as Ephraim, not as severe as the 10 tribes, but they have plenty of their own moral problems as well. And therefore, they too ultimately may be exiled. And of course, that's what happens. So again, the pattern is when he begins to rebuke the northern tribes, the 10 tribes of Israel, gives a few verses of praise to his own people, to the people of Judea. And then he says, however, and eventually the people of Judea will also turn away from God, and they too will be punished. So that's the big view. That's the overview. Of course, the beginning, that's chapter 28. Chapter 27, the prophet evokes the kindness that God did for the Jewish people in Egypt. And of course, that's the link to our Haftorah, the mentioning of what God did for us in Egypt. Now, you may looking at me funny. What did God do for us in Egypt? God did for us by taking us out of Egypt. Yes, but it begins by when we came to Egypt. When we came to Egypt, Egypt is the land where we became a mighty people. We became a great people. So we'll see that somehow how Isaiah evokes that imagery of how, even though we think of Egypt as only negative, but in reality, in Egypt, we actually became a great people. Our numbers grew exponentially, as is described in the beginning of this week's parsha. That even though the Egyptians tried to oppress the Jews. As much as they oppressed the Jews, ken yirbe v'chen yifrotz, so would their numbers expand and grow. So that is the overview. If anyone has any comments or questions, please jump in. Otherwise, we turn to the actual words of the prophet. Okay, so we're looking at Isaiah chapter 27. We'll read a little bit in the English. Some of the imagery here is a little bit poetic and a little bit difficult to understand. So I have the commentaries here, and we'll see what we could make of this. Again, the first unit, pretty much from the beginning all the way to chapter 28 to verse 13. In other words, from verse 6 to verse 13 is pretty much the first unit, and then we get to the chapter 28. Okay, so let's read a little bit. Those who came, whom Jacob caused to take root, Israel flourished and blossomed, and they filled the face of the world with fruitage. Now, this is not exactly the way it sounds. It's much more poetic. In other words, this isn't really an explanation. You want to read it literally, it reads something like this. Habaim, those who came, Yashresh Yaakov, Yaakov takes root. In other words, the Jewish people take root in Egypt, and Israel flourishes. But what's the imagery that you're getting here? Right? We look at Egypt and we say the real question about so this is really addressing, this is a big idea, because this is not just a poetic image, but this is a big idea. The question, of course, becomes when we start thinking about the book of Exodus, and we say, why were the Jewish people enslaved in Egypt? Could somebody explain to me rationally why it was decreed that they should be in Egypt for, they were in Egypt for 210 years. Slavery was for about 80 years. But we know, going back to the covenant of the parts, we know that the Jewish people were, God promises Abraham that his descendants will be foreigners in a foreign land for 400 years until they come back. Why did this happen? What did the Jewish people do wrong? Did they sin? They sin. Is it a punishment? What are they doing in Egypt? Why did they do it in the slavery? So the Torah itself does not give an answer to that question explicitly. Moshe in Deuteronomy says two words that may give us some light on this big theological question of what did the Jewish people do wrong that was decreed to have to be in Egypt. And Moshe's words, he says, God took you out of Egypt, but before Egypt, he says, Mikur HaBarzel, God took you out from the place where they refine silver. How do you refine silver? You take or gold or any precious metal, you take it and you put it into the fire. And when you put it into the fire, the dirt and the impure parts of the metal surface to the top, and then you can clean it off. In other words, this is the first time in the Torah, or the only time in the Torah, where Moses refers to Pharaoh, to Egypt, not as something completely negative. In other words, something that has a positive aspect. That is the refining of the Jewish people. Spiritually speaking, when a person was broken and humbled, that could be a moment for spiritual growth. And it seems, at least the way the Kabbalists read this verse, that is that's the imagery that Isaiah is evoking. Because he doesn't just say we came to Egypt, few in number, and we increased. Okay, no, he says we were planted in Egypt. Yashresh means we took root. We were planted in Egypt, and then we flourished. Because we were planted, we flourished. So one way to look at this, the way the Kabbalists look at this, is if you want to think about what is Egypt, you have to think about the process of planting. What happens when you plant something? Take a seed, and the seed looks beautiful. Maybe you can even eat it. You put it in the earth. And what happens when you put it in the earth? It germinates. It loses its identity. It rots. And you say, what's happening here? Why is this precious seed losing its previous identity? Why are you putting it in the earth to lose its to lose its form and shape. It was so nice on the shelf. What are you doing? What are you putting into the earth? And what's the answer? The answer is by losing its previous form, it now develops into a new form. Now it grows into far greater produce than it was when it was sitting on your shelf. So the process of germination is really a process of growth. And that's really what's happening in Egypt. And that's why the imagery is we were planted in Egypt. Because we were planted in Egypt, that's why Israel flourishes. Now, the same could be said about not just the Jewish people being planted in Egypt and growing in Egypt, but it's also in the spiritual Egypt, and that is the soul descending into the body. The body for the soul is also in Egypt. It's also a form of prison. When the soul is in heaven, the soul is in spiritual tranquility. When the soul is implanted into the earth, into this body, it is in some ways trapped, in some ways forced to, it loses part of its old identity. It has a new way of interacting with the world. Its understanding shifts. It's traumatic for the soul. But why does God do this? Why does God place the soul in the body? The answer, of course, is the imagery of the planting. When you plant, you maybe lose the previous form, but the growth is exponential. And the passion and the commitment to God that could be achieved in this world where there is opposition, where there is challenge, that is something that the soul grows into, and the soul could not have it, just like you have to actually plant the seed into the earth if you want to get that growth. So that is just something on the first phrase of the first verse of the Haftorah, those who came, whom Jacob caused to take root. Or you can read it, Jacob took root. Yashresh Yaakov, not Jacob caused to take root. Jacob, the Jewish people, took root. They were planted into the earth. What happened? Israel flourished and blossomed, and they filled the face of the world with footage. They spread all over, and they give it food. And the dairy company in Israel, there are two dairy companies. One dairy company, the first one was called, and probably the bigger one is called Tnuva. And that word Tnuva is right here. This word from the Haftorah. Malupnei Tevel, it was full, the earth of Tnuva. Tnuva means, they translated it as fruitage. But Tnuva comes from the word Tnu, what it gives forth, right? When the produce gives forth, that's the word. Even the word produce means what it gives forth, what it produces. That's the word Tnuva. And in Israel, every kid in Israel knows what Tnuva is because that's the name of the big dairy company. Okay, now that we start.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Oh. About the names of, so the verse says that Jacob was planted and Israel flourished. Does it mean that by physically planting the roots, physically planting, the spirituality grows, the spiritual name?
Yeah, that's what it could mean. There's also other interpretations, but you're taking me too quickly to the Kabbalah. From the Kabbalistic levels, when you talk about the human soul, there's two levels. There's Yaakov and Yisrael. Yaakov is the lower parts of the soul. Yisrael is the higher parts of the soul, the more elevated parts of the soul. Not all of the soul descends into the body. In other words, part of the soul descends into the body. The rest hovers above. In other words, it's not fully invested. And according to Judaism, sometimes when a person, where do you get your what today's psychology would call the subconscious, what Judaism would call the supraconscious, in other words, the conscious that's above you. You get a good idea, it's because the soul that hovers above you drips into your consciousness. So Yisrael is that part of you which does not fully descend into this earth, it's still in heaven, in a sense. And that's why he's not going to say that Israel was planted in the earth, because Israel was never planted in the earth. You see what I'm saying? Israel wasn't planted in the body. And therefore Israel, no matter how far I could descend spiritually, part of me is still going to be connected to holiness. How so? That's the Yisrael. That's the Israel. Now, make no mistake. Don't think that only the Jacob benefits from the descent. Even Israel, which doesn't descend, benefits from the Jacob descending. In other words, when Jacob overcomes the challenges of this world and focuses and is forced to come up with the courage to move forward in a proper way, that benefit that Jacob produces actually rubs off and actually strengthens Israel as well. So that's a good point. And the Kabbalah spends a lot of time about this, these two terms, Yaakov and Israel. Jacob takes root in the earth. Israel doesn't. Part of you doesn't. You may know that the word in Hebrew, mazal tov, good luck. What does it mean, good luck? Literally, the word mazal means to drip or to drip, to leak. So if I see you and I want to say congratulations, I say, mazel tov, you should have a good leak. What am I saying? That your roof should leak? I'm saying that the soul, the essence of your soul that hovers above you, that all that infinite potential, some of that infinite potential should drip into your conscious life. So that's the word mazal. That whole idea of mazal only works because we believe that most of your soul has not descended into your body, has not descended into your consciousness. It hovers above. And therefore it's not fully affected when you're in exile. So no matter what place I descend to spiritually, I'm still rooted. Part of me is still very much outside of this earth and very much connected still to heaven. And if I get an inspiration out of the blue, I have an inspiration. I want to transform. I want to become better. I want to be altruistic. Where does that come from? That doesn't come from the Jacob. That comes from the Israel.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we have verse 8. Verse 7 is the prophet wants us to think about, now that we talk about Egypt, we want to take the message of Egypt. What's the message from Egypt? That God punished the Egyptians measure for measure. A lot of what happens in the first three portions of the book of Exodus is that the Egyptians were punished. Why were they punished? Well, you could say because they punished because they enslaved the Jews. But if you look carefully, the sages point out that whatever God's measurement is measure for measure. Whatever they did to the Jews, that is what was done to them. Beginning in this week's parsha, when we read about how Pharaoh commanded that all the firstborns, all the sons should be thrown into the Nile, drowned in the Nile. And then what happens at the end of the story? The end of the story is the Egyptians are drowned in the sea. So that's measure for measure. So seeing that measure for measure, not only that the Egyptians were punished, but they were punished in the same way that they harmed the Jews, that represents God, that points to God's providence and how there's reward and punishment in this world. So that's what the prophet wants us to pay attention to. Like the smiting who smote him, did he smite him? Like the slaying of the slain ones, was he slain? It's a question. Don't you see that the same way the Egyptians smote the Jews, they were punished? Can't you see that the same way he slayed, he became slayed? In other words, to show that the same thing that they did happened to them. And then he continues in 8. In the measure when they sent them out, it drove with him. In other words, when they sent the Jews out of Egypt, you could see that the same measure that the Egyptians measured to the Jews, that was measured to them. We see that in the story of the Exodus. He spoke with him harsh wind on the day of the east wind. In other words, when God blew the east wind, when did God blow the east wind? Well, if you read the story of the splitting of the sea, it says that the way the sea split is because there was an east wind blowing at the water all night. So this is a reference specifically to the splitting of the sea. Again, because the splitting of the sea, the last or the end of the story of Egypt connects to the beginning of the story when they drown, when they're being drowned as a punishment for drowning the Egyptians, drowning the Jewish firstborn. So that imagery of the sea is what Isaiah is evoking. In other words, first of all, he's saying, remember the miracles that God did for you. He planted you in Egypt and you became a full people there. And then he says, remember how God punished those people who oppressed you. And not only did he punish them, but he punished them in the same way that they punished you, in the sense that highlights God's providence. And therefore, now what's the takeaway for us? Takeaway for us is if we follow God's ways, we will be blessed. If not, we too will be punished. And what is the thing that Isaiah is battling? Idol worship. And that's what he's going to talk about now, about breaking the idols and breaking the altars of the idols. So that's what we read in verse 9. Therefore, with this shall Jacob's iniquity be atoned for. And this is all the fruit of removing his sins. How should he be atoned for? How should he remove the sin? By making all their altar stones like crushed chalk stones, to crash, menupots, to shatter. The word crushed is really shattered. You want to shatter the stones of the altars. Asherim and sun images shall not rise. Asherim is the trees that they would plant to serve idols. They would serve idols under those trees. And chamanim is also a word for idols. So in other words, now that we took the message of Egypt, we too could be forgiven if we shatter the idols. Now, if we do so, it's not clear who verse 10 is talking to, but you'll see in a minute, it's talking to the oppressors of the Jews. For a fortified city is solitary, a dwelling is forsaken and abandoned like a pasture. There a calf shall graze, and there he shall lie and consume its branches. Well, not the perfect example. Pasture should be like a desert, kamidbar. So who are we talking to? So the commentaries say we're talking about that. We're talking about the enemies of the Jews. Ir B'tzura, the fortified city, is talking about the enemies of the Jews. If we break the idol worshippers, the idols, then the fortified cities that oppressed us, specifically probably referring to the kingdoms south of Israel, specifically Edom, if we do that, then those fortified cities will be broken, will be abandoned, and there will be abandoned like a desert. There a calf shall graze, and there he shall lie and consume its branches. Who's the calf? The calf is the 10 tribes. The calf will then go and be able to graze and benefit from the land of their enemies. When will that happen? That will happen when the enemies. That will happen if the Jews follow God and shatter the idols. Now we're continuing to 11. Again, we're talking about. We're still focused on the enemies. When its branches dry out, they shall be broken. Women shall come and ignite it. For it is not a people of understanding. Who is not a people of understanding? The enemy. They don't realize that their power came from God. Therefore, its maker shall not have compassion on it, and he who formed it shall not grant it favor. So again, if we break our idols, those cities of our oppressors who were once very fortified, now they're going to be alone and empty like a desert. And we, the calf, will expand and eat and graze in their territory. Why? Because they are a nation that does not have wisdom. They don't recognize that everything comes from Hashem. Don't worry. If you think he's harsh, Isaiah is harsh on the enemies. Just wait till he turns his attention to the people of Ephraim. Then it gets tough. Okay, let's continue. Now we talk about the time when God will bring the Jewish people back to Israel. Again, if we return to God and we break our idols. Here we go. And it shall come to pass on that day that the Lord shall gather from the flood of the river to the east to the stream of Egypt, and you shall be gathered one by one, O children of Israel. Children of Israel. In other words, we're going to be gathered. God will go and take us from all the places we were sent, from the river of Egypt and to the other river. What's the other river? It doesn't say explicitly. It's the Euphrates. This is where the Jewish people were in Babylonia. And you will be brought back one by one, O children of Israel. Very beautiful. And 13 is a very beautiful verse. And this is evoked in our Rosh Hashanah prayers. We mentioned it because on Rosh Hashanah we're supposed to mention 10 verses of shofar. And we mentioned 13. And this is the verse we alluded to earlier. And it shall come to pass in that day that a great shofar shall be sounded. And those lost in the land of Assyria and those exiled in the land of Egypt shall come, and they shall prostrate themselves before the Lord on the holy mount in Jerusalem. Beautiful. The Hasidic commentaries explain that there's the verse 13 talks about how people will come back from the exile. And in general, he names two places. He says those lost in the land of Assyria and those who are lost in the land of Egypt, are pushed away in the land of Egypt. And the Hasidic commentaries explain there's generally two types of exiles. There's an exile where the Jewish people were oppressed, and that was a terrible danger for the Jewish people. But then there's also another type of exile, and that was the places where the Jewish people were not oppressed, they were accepted, but the price to pay was assimilation. And these are the lands where the people were flourished. So the Hasidic commentary explained, if you look at verse 13, he says, we're sent to who will come back, both extremes, those lost in the land of Assyria, Ashur. Ashur is Assyria, but Ashur is also could also be from the word Osher, which is fortune, not fortune as in wealth. For that you need an Ashur with an ayin. But Ashur means the land of the fortunate. So some Jews were pushed away in the land of the fortunate. In other words, that caused the assimilation. Others were oppressed in the land of Egypt. They say exiled, oppressed is pushed away. Nidachim is pushed away. Mitzrayim, we know the word Mitzrayim means straits, means being pushed into narrow spaces. So when that final shofar will be sounded, then both types of exiles will return. Those pushed away in the lands of oppression, as well as those pushed away in the fortunate lands. So that's just a tidbit. That is, so here, that's the connection to, that's the end of chapter 27. That's a beautiful uplifting point and reminding us of Egypt, which is the connection to this parsha. Now, there's no fun. Now, Isaiah goes after the drunkards of Ephraim. What does it mean? They're drunkards. They have too much wine. They have too much wealth. And they're totally intoxicated, not thinking about Hashem, not thinking about God, not thinking about the looming danger from the kingdom of Assyria, which was about to attack them only a few short years later, and attack them and exile them. And as we said, the way 28 turns, the first few verses, all the way from 1 to 4, refers to rebuke against the tribes of the 10 tribes, which is Ephraim. Then 5 and 6 talk about how Judah were not in that level. Judah were loyal to God, but then 7 until the end talks about how even the people of Judah are not listening to the prophets. And in very beautiful language, it describes how Isaiah describes how he is being ignored and how the people laugh at him. And how people say he's immature and he's talking like a child. And again, I don't know if we'll have time to cover all of this, but we'll try to go. Maybe I'll try to pick up this the speed and go a little quicker so we can finish the entire Haftorah, or at least try to. Woe is to the crown of the pride of the drunkards of Ephraim, and the young fruit of an inferior fig is the position of its glory. In other words, right now, it looks like a young fruit. It looks like it has a lot of potential, but it's going to woe onto it because it's going to be destroyed, which is at the end of the valley. I don't know who translates this, which is at the end of a valley of fatness, crushed by wine. Literally, it says Gei Shmanim. They translate this as the valley of fatness, but fatness is shamen, but it could also be shemen, oil, right? We're in Ephraim until today. In Samaria is where there are olive trees. So he's looking at, so Isaiah is talking about the wealth of the people of Ephraim who are drunk in wine, who sit on top of the hills which overlook the valleys of oil, but they're crushed by wine. Halumei, it means that they're being knocked in the head with wine. Behold, God has a strong and powerful wind, like a downpour of hail, a storm of destruction, like the stream of a powerful flooding water. He lays it on the land with his hand. In other words, it looks like you have a beautiful valley full of oil, but the flood can come and wash it all away. Number 3, with his feet they shall be trampled, the crown of the pride of the drunkards of Ephraim. And his glorious beauty shall be the young fruit of an inferior fig, which is on the head of the valley of fatness, or the head of the valley of oil, as a fig that ripens before the summer, which if the seer sees it, he will swallow it while it is still in his hand. So we're describing a scenario where you come to your field in the summer in the first fruit and you see it, and when it's before it even has time to ripen, you eat it. And the person eating this fig is the Assyrian Empire about to destroy the fig, which is the kingdom of Ephraim. And then we turn to 5 and 6. 5 and 6 is now he shifts to the remnant of his people, the rest of his people. Who are the rest of the people who will not be swallowed like the young fig? They are the kingdom of Judah in the south who are still loyal to God. On that day, verse 5, on that day the Lord of hosts shall be a crown, shall be for a crown of beauty, and for a diadem of glory for the rest of his people, and for the spirit of justice to who sits in judgment, and for might for those who bring back the war to the gate. In other words, God will give strength to the people who are interested in justice. They're not drunk, they're interested in justice. And when he says who bring back the war to the gate, means like they're also warriors. The sages say this is not warriors in the simple sense. This is the figurative sense. The people who battle in the discussions and in the studies and in the debates of Torah. So that is saying how there'll be a remnant. God will allow the 10 tribes to go to Israel and to go to exile. The 10 tribes of Israel to go to exile and be swallowed by the enemy, but God will be with the remnant of his people, which is Judea, and I'll be with those who have the spirit of justice. However, he says they too start getting drunk. In other words, Judah itself starts getting drunk and starts moving away from justice. So let's
Rabbi, question for you. Is this an allusion to the blessing that Jacob gives Judah about him being a drunk at the very end of Jacob's life?
Jacob gives a description of wine. Wine is not a problem. Wine is neutral. Wine is pleasure, right? So you can get wine in a way that you're not drunk. And then could be drunkenness. Drunkenness means you allow the wine to take over your life. In other words, is the wine here as a luxury, as a pleasure, something to enhance your life, then it's kosher and okay and positive. He keeps talking about the sense of a drunk. Drunk is the wine, the success, the pleasure causes them to lose their judgments, not only in the spiritual sense, certainly, but it was also in the political sense. They weren't able to realize the danger that was looming from the Assyrian kingdom because they were so invested in their own pleasures. So wine is not a problem. Judah was blessed with wine. The question becomes, are we getting drunk?
So in the blessing from Jacob to Judah, is that all positive, the wine stuff?
All positive. And Rashi talks about in the commentaries, it talks about the vines, the imagery of the wine. He will launder his garment in wine. That's an image of abundance of wine. But wine is beautiful. Wine is a blessing. Wine is wealth. There's nothing wrong with that per se. The problem becomes if when your person gets drunk. And it's interesting to see what the problem is with Judah. Judah, he says, before he called them, they have ruach mishpat. They have the spirit of justice. So justice is fine. But then look at 7. 7 is interesting. These two, who two? Also Judah erred because of wine and strayed because of strong wine. Priest and prophet erred because of strong wine. They became corrupt because of wine. They went astray because of strong wine. They erred against the seer. They caused justice to stumble. What's happening here? We know that this Torah says 2 people are not allowed to drink wine. In other words, if someone drinks wine, even a small measurement of wine, they're not allowed to do the service in the temple. Wine is very good. Pleasure is very good, but not in the temple. A priest comes before God. He has to be completely present and aware. And therefore, if you drink a little bit of wine, you're not allowed to do the service in the temple until the wine evaporates. Then the Torah says explicitly, not only the priest, but also the judge, right? If the judge is a rabbi or a judge is not allowed to give a ruling if they drank wine, even if it's a simple law that everybody knows, okay? So what happens here? The prophet, the priest, the seer, who's the seer? Those who do, the judge who's supposed to perform justice, they also stumble in wine. And that's the problem. So wine becomes a problem if you got drunk. But even if you're not drunk, but if the wine is interfering with the justice, then the justice stumbles. Okay, now the next verse. There's many ways of interpreting this. One way, I don't know how to do this. One way, let's just read the verse. Whom shall he teach knowledge, and to whom shall he explain the message? To those who weaned from milk, removed from breasts. What does this mean? One interpretation is, who should the prophet talk to? Everyone else is drunk. Who's going to listen to the prophets? Only the children, right? The children just weaned from milk. They were just removed from breasts, from nursing. In other words, one way to read this, one way to read this is that the prophet is saying, everyone else is drunk. Nobody's listening to me except for the kids. Another interpretation is, it's the drunk people telling the prophets, you don't come to us, don't speak to us. We have wisdom. You want to talk, you want to preach to the children. And Yud on 10 is very interesting. For a precept, a precept for a precept, a line for a line, a line for a line, a little here, a little there. What does that mean? What do I do with this? In Hebrew, it's even funnier. Tzav la tzav, tzav la tzav, kav la kav, kav la kav. Okay, so this is certainly a poem. There's certainly something interesting. It's a play on words. What's happening here?
Is the word tzav mean to be mitzvah?
Yes, so tzav comes in the word commandments. Tzav la tzav. So here they translate it as precept. Precept for a precept, precept for a precept. A line for a line, a line for a line, a little here, a little there. So there's different ways of interpreting it. One way, the traditional way of interpreting this verse is, instead of a precept, they have their own precept. Instead of a line means a line. Kav would mean, a kav can mean a line, but it could also be a measuring stick, like a measuring stick. So the line that helps you measure. So it could be read, instead of a precept, they have their own precept. Instead of a line to measure, they have their own way of measuring. Ze'er, a little bit, if a little bit here, a little bit there. What does that mean? So I'll first give you the simple the traditional interpretation is that for a precept, when the prophet comes and tells them the precept of God, they say, we have another precept. We have the precept of the idol. When the prophet comes and says, this is the line, the way you should measure, the way you should value, this is how you determine what's right and wrong. They say, no, we have our own measuring stick of how we interpret value. A little here, a little there. When I say a little here, when the prophet says in a little while, the punishment will come, they say, okay, a little there, let's take this little while and let's use it to continue having a good time. For with distorted speech and in another language does he speak to this people? In other words, there's no communication. It's not clear if the prophet is talking or the people are talking. The people could be saying, we don't understand you. We're drunk. You're talking to us. We don't understand what you're saying. For he said to them, this is rest. Give rest to the weary. And this is the tranquility. But they would not listen. In other words, the prophet is telling them, I'm speaking for your own good. I want to give you rest. I want to give you tranquility. But they don't want to listen. And the word of the Lord shall be for them a precept for a precept, a precept for a precept, a line for a line, a line for a line, a little here, a little there, in order that they go and stumble backward and be broken and be trapped and caught. What is he saying? Because of verse 11, verse 13, the first half of verse 13 is a repetition of verse 11. Because they're not listening, verse 10. Verse 13 is a repetition of verse 10. Because they have a precept for a precept, whatever the prophet says, they have their own mitzvah. Whatever the prophet presents as God's way of determining what's right and wrong, they have their own way of determining. So because of that, so in other words, they're not listening to the prophet. Because they're not listening to the prophet, that's the punishment. The punishment is because you don't listen, now you lose the ability to listen. And what happens at the end in order that they eventually stumble. So that's one way of reading it. I read the more modern way of reading this, that tzav la tzav, tzav la tzav, kav la kav, kav la kav. It sounds like the way you talk to a child, right? They're very one-syllable words and they're repeated. And they're talking to and it's like talking to a child. So when the people mock what the prophet is telling the people, they mock it the way you speak to a child. In other words, they're saying the prophet talks to us as if we're children, as if we're immature. He keeps repeating the same message and nobody's listening to. And we're more sophisticated than the prophets. And therefore, we're not taking the prophet's words to heart. So if that's the way you read it, then it's not just poetry, but it's also mocking the words of the prophet. The words are very short, one syllable words, tzav lakat, tzav, tzav tzav, kav lakav, kav lakav. And that's the people mocking the words of the prophet. And then the prophet is in 13. Because you mock the prophet, that will be the punishment. You're mocking the prophet, so you're not going to take them heed to heart. So eventually you will stumble. And finally, we don't have the rest of the chapter. We skip to 29 because we want to finish with something positive. And we talk about how in the time of redemption, things turn around. And eventually, in times of redemption, the people would return to God. And when the people return to God, their ancestors, the patriarchs, will once again be very proud of them. Therefore, so we skipped. You notice we went from 13, we skipped half of the chapter of 28, and we're only taking 2 verses from chapter 29. Therefore, so said the Lord to the house of Jacob, who redeemed Abraham. Now Jacob shall not be ashamed, and now his face shall not pale. In other words, when we were sinning, Jacob is ashamed because his children are disobeying God. But when eventually when we return, no longer will Jacob be ashamed. For when he sees his children, the work of his hands in his midst, who shall hallow my name, and they shall hallow the Holy One of Jacob, and the God of Israel, they shall revere. Why will he not be ashamed? Because he will see his children who are sanctifying God and hallowing God and revering God, and that will be when the people return to God. So that's the story in short. Again, summarize quickly. The beginning is the reference of Egypt, and that's the connection to the Parsha, how God plants us in Egypt, and there we become a great people, and there God punishes the Egyptians in a way that's measure for measure. And then we say, take that to heart. He tries to say, the problem is the people of Ephraim cannot take it to heart because they're too drunk in success, intoxicated by their wealth. And then he says, Judah is not that way. Judah, for the time being, is still listening. Eventually, Judah also would not listen. Eventually, they're going to mock the prophet, not listen to the prophet, and that will be their downfall. But eventually, the people will come back and make their ancestors proud. That's the story in short. If anybody has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. And this is the big idea that whenever there's a challenge, you could look at it as a thing, something that's here to take us down, to destroy us, to make us rot, to pull us apart, or you can look at it as a seed planted in the earth that's going to germinate into something much greater. But for that, you have to have the process of letting go. The seed has to let go of its old image to be able to grow into something new. And for some people, it's very hard to let go, but you can't grow unless you let go. So that's the story in short. Everybody have a wonderful day, and we should see each other in good health.